rumors, existing trees, compiled records that's someone's family history, use them as an idea. It might be a great idea that's accurate and documented and has sources, and it might be a horrible idea, and it might even be made up. Because what am I talking about when I talk about shoddy research? Well, we know that throughout history, and I'm especially thinking of medieval times, people would create family histories, royal pedigrees, because they wanted to be connected to the royals. We see that coming up into the present. In the late 1890s and 1900s, there was a very well-known genealogist who they've actually found he had very high-ranking clients and who wanted to be connected to rich and powerful families, and some of that research was made up. Okay? And we're talking, this is like, what, 100 years ago. And then even online today, going into the next one, so people's access to records hasn't been as plentiful as it is today. And this is kind of one of the strange oxymorons that I find in family history. The farther we get into the future, and as technology increases, the more records from the past are available to us. So you think about the kinds of records that were available 15 years ago. Ancestry, we've been online for 15 years, is our 15th anniversary this year. And the amount of records that are available on Ancestry.com and all sorts of websites now is so vast compared to what was 15 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 100 years ago. So if you're looking at a family history created 100 years ago, you might be thinking, well, this is much closer, in time to when, the 1700s or the 1600s, and you're right. But think about the records that they had access to and what they could actually to get a hold of. It's just amazing how much we're able to do that we couldn't do 15 or 50 or 100 years ago. So keep that in mind. In fact, one of the trees that we were working on, we were in colonial Virginia, and we kind of researched into this family, and there was a very well-known published family history, and I gotta tell you, it was wrong. And we've spent a lot of time debunking that because they didn't have access to the records. And the last thing is that there's researchers who jump to conclusions. They see one record and they see another, and without doing thorough research, they just jump to conclusions. This is my great-grandmother. Her name's Emily, but we called her Mimi. She was into genealogy. She's a sweet lady. Doesn't she look like a genealogist? She's going to go to the library and do genealogy. Don't trust her research, okay? Cannot trust it. Okay, first of all, she has told us that we are related to William Howard Taft, and the proof of this is because we have Tafts in our family tree. That is the only proof. Okay. Second, she is a member of the Daughters of the, she was a member, a very proud card-holding member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. It's a lineage society. You have to prove that you had a patriot in your family tree. I really question the accuracy of the research. There was a time when the DIR was not vetting their submissions as well as they should have been. So I question the accuracy of the research. But my favorite story is the death of Daniel Moore. So this is Daniel Moore. It's supposedly a picture of Daniel Moore, let me say it that way. He's my third or fourth great-grandfather. Now, the documents tell us, and they're very clear on this, that he's born in Kentucky around 1815. He married in eastern Iowa in 1840. 10 years later, he's living with his wife and children in western Illinois. Now, the last known of his children, if he was in fact the father, I don't have any reason to doubt that, but we always have to throw that in there. The last known of his children was born around 1857, and then 3 years later in the 1860 census, he's not living with his wife and children. They're back in Iowa. So the question is, what happened to Daniel Moore? Now, the family rumor is that Daniel Moore and his wife kind of split up, and that she eventually moved to Washington, I should say territory and not state, excuse me, it was a territory at that point. I know that's true because I've documented it. She did go out there with a couple of her children. Her other children kind of scattered into the West. But this family rumor is that he stayed in Illinois and that he was living in Chicago. That's where I start to question it, because they weren't living in Chicago. Okay. Then apparently in the 1890s, one of the sons visited and said, Dad was alive and well. But then you dig in a little bit more, and the family rumor also says he didn't see his dad. He just said his dad was alive and well. I don't know what's going on. So Mimi, being a researcher, she found Daniel Moore's let me go back. She found Daniel Moore's death certificate. And it's for Daniel Moore, and he's born in Kentucky. He died in Chicago in the 1890s, but the age of death was in his 30s. Now, Mimi saw the same problem that I saw with this record, because a man who was born in 1815, even if there was no informant, should not look like he's in his mid-30s when in the 1890s. And so this is where Mimi and I diverge a little bit, because where I would say this might not be my Daniel Moore's record, I'm going to put a picture of her back up. This is her explanation. If you notice, the doctor's last name is O'Rourke, and he's obviously Irish, and he probably had a little bit too much to drink, a wee bit too much of the brandy before filling out that death certificate. Now, I need to tell you, she had a copy of the death certificate. She turned it over and wrote this on the back. So I actually have this document with that writing on it, so that's how I know. Okay. Please beware the Mimis that have done research on your family tree, okay? That is not his death record. I haven't found it yet, but that is not his death record. Okay, beware of the Mimis in your family tree. So we're going to move on from family rumor. And how do you beware the Mimis in your tree? How do you get through family rumor? Well, you look for the stories and you look for what the documents tell you. So we're going to talk about story hints, and we're going to look at things, the clues to look for in the documents that you already have or that you're going to find. Okay, the first one, look for unexpected places. So children born in San Francisco, California in the 1850s could be a clue to what? The gold rush. If you see that, say, that's interesting. I'm going to dig into that a little bit more. Okay, what about an English family where they have family members dying in India in the mid-1800s? What does that make you think of? The English colonization of India. That's interesting. Let's dig in. Okay, what about a great-grandfather born in Australia in the mid to late 1800s? The prison camps, the transportation of convicts to Australia during the 1800s. That's interesting. Let's dig in. Unusual places of residence. So this is a great thing in the census that I don't know if a lot of people notice. But at the top of the census header, usually it'll say like city and state and county that the people are living in. But if there's an institution, it will list that. So an institution can be hospitals or orphanages or asylums or military bases. So it's not like, institution kind of has a negative connotation in our mind. So it could be like any kind of organization. Just pardon me for a second. Okay, so here's a couple examples. So the first one is from the 1910 census, and this is actually Senator John McCain's grandfather. And he was on the USS Washington in the Navy Yard in Puget Sound, Washington. Okay, so he's on a ship. So, that's interesting. If you didn't know that your ancestors were in the military, that's a great clue to that he was living on a ship, okay, in a Navy Yard. The next one is, this is actually one of Daniel Moore's sons, and it's from right here in Portland. And this surprised me because I didn't know that I had Oregon relatives. Well, I don't really, but in the 1920 census, he's in Multnomah, the Multnomah farm. And so I did some research. I was like, that's interesting. What's the Multnomah farm? And it was something like a poor workhouse. Maybe some of you know more about this, and you can tell me more about this later, and I'd really appreciate that. But from what I found, it's kind of a poor workhouse that was out, it was like east. I think it was like in Troutdale area. So, Richfield? Okay. Oh, Edgefield. Okay. So, yes. See, some of you know. And the last one is for Mimi's husband, actually. And it was 1930 census, and he's living at the U.S. Navy Yard in Washington. So if I hadn't known that he was in the military, that's an amazing clue. Start digging. Why is he living in a Navy Yard? Okay. All right. The next thing is I want to tell you a little bit about Cherie Paolello, who is an NBC anchor in Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, she was interested in her Italian roots on her dad's side. So we started digging in, and we actually digged in on all sides of her family tree, and we found her maternal great-grandmother in the 1900 census. Now, her name is Helen Marcus, and she was 14 years old, but she was not living with her family. And now, many of you know that there's a column in the census that says, how are you related to the head of this household? And right here it says that she is a ward. Well, what does that mean? What does ward mean? Okay. Now the next thing is right above her is Stella Marcus. And look at their ages. They were born the same month of the same year. Twins? Is that her twin sister? And they're both wards. What's going on here? So this is the header. And if you click on it and expand what that institution is, by the way, institution is right here, I've just expanded it. They're living in the Jewish Orphan Asylum in Cleveland, Ohio. This made us wonder because all of the people on the previous page were girls, so there's pages of girls listed in age order. A few pages later, we found 12-year-old Henry Marcus, and on the next page, we found 10-year-old Sydney Marcus. We have great reason to believe that these are Helen's brothers, that they are 4 children living in this orphan home. And so I actually did some research on this, and online, I found pictures of the orphan home. Okay, now, Cherie's had no idea about any of this. And furthermore, this leads to my next look for interesting ethnicities or nationalities. Cherie had no idea, let me back up. So Helen Marcus was Jewish. We did some more research, and her parents were both Jewish as well. Cherie had no idea that she was Jewish. Now, a little bit about the Jewish heritage if you don't know. It's passed down the mother's line. So you are Jewish if your mother was Jewish, and she was Jewish if her mother was Jewish, and your grandmother was Jewish if her mother was Jewish. So it's passed down that straight maternal line. Helen Marcus is the direct maternal great-grandmother of Cherie, which means that Cherie is considered Jewish. She just doesn't, it's not just that she has Jewish heritage, she is Jewish, and she had no idea. Okay? So, everyday person, to me, this is mind-blowing. Okay. Next, look for ancestors' occupations. This is a big one, and occupations, I find, it's one of the first things I look for when I'm evaluating a family tree. So individuals who change occupations with every document, find out what's going on there, dig in a little bit more. Actually, I'll say that on a couple of trees, this is how we've uncovered some very shady characters, okay? People who are changing occupations, especially drastic occupation changes, okay? Occupations that match or contradict family stories, and that kind of goes back to the Robesons that were tailors for the King and Queen of England. I am finding documents that are starting to match it in some places. And this is actually the census record for William Robeson. He's my 3rd great-grandfather. It's from England, and it says Master Tailor. I know you can't make that out very well, but it says Master Tailor. So starting to prove it, or something like that. So trends among generations. Is everybody in your family line a shoemaker or some other occupation? Now, Mark Zuckerberg, he's the founder of Facebook. I have to tell you, his family, they're Jewish immigrants who have been in this country for about 4 to 5 generations. And every man in that family was a tailor or a peddler or both at some time in their life. On both sides of his tree, every single man was one of those 2 occupations. I kind of find that interesting. And the last thing I'd say is look for women with occupations that are other than keeping house or cook or maid or school teacher. Those are the pretty common occupations. One of the NBC reporters I worked with in San Diego, we started digging in and we found her great-grandmother, Bertha. And Bertha in 1930, is a widow of 65 years old, and she's the vice president of a tannery. That's kind of an interesting occupation for a 65-year-old woman in 1930. If you go down a little bit, her son is the treasurer of a tannery. That's a huge clue that this is a family business, okay? So we dug into that a little more to find out about the tannery. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist, but it no longer exists. But that's a big clue. That's a big, that's interesting. And it turns out that they were tanners back in Germany, and they brought that over and started a family business. And when her husband died, she took it over. Look for clues about deaths. And as morbid as it is, deaths provide some of the biggest hints to stories. And so we're always on the lookout for deaths, as morbid as that sounds. And the first thing is deaths of children. So the 1900 and the 1910 censuses, they asked women, how many children have you given birth to? How many children are still alive? And we saw this in Gail Martin's segment. And what I say is that mortality rates of children are a huge clue to about the living conditions of the family and what was going on, not to mention the heartbreak that our ancestors must have gone through. And so here's Bertha again. This is 1900, and and her husband Julius is still alive. But I want you to notice right here, maybe I'll try this, it's right behind me. That says, how many children have you given birth to? And how many are still living? It looks like 17. I actually think it's 11. Regardless, she lost half her children. And that is heartbreaking. It's not just a number on a page. This woman was an immigrant. She was, and we believe that they were Jewish, that they came to the United States to escape persecution. She loses half her children in her life. Now, we dug in a little bit more, and we found this register of stillbirths from New Jersey. And we found that in 1897, Julius and Bertha Lixman lost a daughter who was stillborn because of knotting of cords. As I do family history, the thing, and I'm sorry, I'm passionate and emotional about this. As we do family history, we find things about our ancestors that we should relate to their lives and their emotions and what they went through. And the thing about mortality rates of children is that you see over and over again children dying of things that we don't lose children to anymore. Knotting of cords is something that does not happen very often anymore. We have cesarean sections, we have other things that this doesn't happen. And I would say, along with this, look for the human side of your ancestors. Birthing 11 children, only 6 survive, and losing a child, like something of knotting of cords. How tragic. Causes of death are also clues. Look for patterns. Are several family members dying around the same time or of the same disease? I was evaluating a reporter's family tree several weeks ago, and I noticed that you have a son dying right near the time of his father, within a couple months of each other. So I was asking the researcher who was working on this, I'm like, what are their causes of death? And he's like, actually, there's 3, because the son had a daughter who died as well during this time period. So we looked in a little bit more, and it seemed to be like there was some kind of flu outbreak at this time, okay? That's the story. Accidents or tragic causes of deaths often will lead you to like an autopsy or a coroner's report or newspaper articles, okay? And unfortunately, I think that it's not a hard stretch because we see this every day. The more tragic the accident, the more documentation you're going to find on it, the more coverage in a newspaper. And I also suggest find out what causes of death mean, especially historical meanings of terms. And this is as easy as a Google search. Now, this is my 3rd great-grandmother, Martha Jane Powers, and I found her death record down here. And if you can't read the record on the bottom, it basically says that she dies on May 14th, 1868 in Vermont of, I don't know if I can say this very well, puerperal fever. Now, on this document, let me point this out. So this is the cause of death, and I couldn't read it very well, and so this is kind of just an extra hint at no charge. What I do when I can't read something on a document is I will take the letters that I think it says, and I'll do a Google search, and often Google will be like, do you mean this? Like, Actually, I do. I didn't know I meant that, but I do mean that. And so I did that. I did that with this as I put in, I actually thought it said Puerfrial or something like that. It's kind of a difficult word to read. And I found out that that's what it said. And it's also known as childbed fever. And it's very common for women after giving birth or after giving a miscarriage. So this, I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. The next thing I looked for was were there any Powers' birth or death of children at the same time period, and I didn't find any. So I think that she maybe had a stillborn child that they didn't record, or maybe she miscarried. I don't really know, but I do know that she left behind a husband and 6 children. And I know that 9 years later, in 1877, one of those 6 children, Maddie, that she married in Fremont, Dodge County, Nebraska. Here's her marriage record. And when I found this marriage record, I had a question. Is it unusual for a 17-year-old to be married to a 27-year-old? Now, I realize that this is historical, but it brings me to my next look for, is to look for age differences, especially between husband and wife, because it could be a story. Now, a very common thing that I find is that it hints at that the wife, if there's a big age difference, if a wife is very much younger, she's a second wife, okay? That perhaps the first wife has died. In this case, actually, well, I got ahead of myself. In this case, actually, so I've done a little bit more research, and their wedding witnesses are not relatives, and I cannot find any of Maddie's relatives living in Nebraska. They're all in Vermont, as far as I can find. So I'm like, what is a 17-year-old girl doing living in the middle of Nebraska in 1877, apparently alone, getting married to a man 10 years older than her? Well, my theory is that about 6 years before this, her dad got remarried to a woman, and my theory is that she and the woman didn't get along, and that she just left one day. Okay, that's my theory. I haven't been able to prove it. I'm still digging in, trying to find out what's going on.